There is a truth buried in the sands of history. Some people worshipped Yahweh before Israel ever became a nation. The same name, the same God. And yet their story was pushed to the edges, whispered only through fragments of stone. Stray lines in ancient texts and echoes in scripture itself. Who were they? How did they know the divine name long before Sinai blazed with covenant fire? And why did history choose silence instead of memory? If Yahweh was known beyond Israel, then the story of faith is far wider, older, and more mysterious than we were ever taught. It stretches across deserts, caravans, tribal altars, and forgotten priests who honored the unseen God long before Israel carried his ark. Here we enter that hidden world where archaeology, theology, and revelation meet and let the evidence speak. Our journey begins not in Israel, but in the wilderness of Midian. Moses disappears from the royal records of Egypt, but he does not vanish from history. He re-enters the story in a forgotten corner of the wilderness, in the land of Midian, among tents, wells, and winds that carry older prayers than empires remember. Here Moses lives not as a prince, but as a shepherd, not under Pharaoh, but under the roof of a priest named Jethro. Jethro is not an Israelite, yet Scripture calls him a priest of Yahweh. The text is unapologetic. Jethro offers sacrifice to Yahweh. Moses, Aaron, and the elders share table fellowship with him. This is not fringe. This is covenant-like worship happening beyond Israel's borders. The implication is staggering. A tradition of honoring Yahweh already exists outside Israel, woven into the faith of desert clans like the Kenites and Midianites. These are Semitic peoples who move across the landscape surrounding Sinai and northwestern Arabia, the very regions where Israel will later encounter God. It means Moses' spiritual world widens long before Sinai. His theology is not born only in Pharaoh's palace or in the blaze of the burning bush. It is quietly shaped over years in the home of a man who already knows the name. When Moses hears Yahweh speak from the bush, the voice does not introduce itself as a novelty. Instead, it identifies with the God of the patriarchs, a continuity, not an invention. Many scholars suggest that Jethro may have helped Moses recognize that this was not a new deity, but the same eternal God, whom desert priests and wandering patriarchs had revered long before Israel existed. Faith is larger than a single lineage. Yahweh was already whispering through unfamiliar tents, through altars unrecorded, through men whose names history almost forgot. And in this sacred realization, we are invited to respond. If you have ever sensed that God was moving long before your story began, speak from your heart. Share the moment you first suspected faith might be the shared inheritance of humanity, not the property of one nation. In doing so, we add our voices to the quiet chorus that has stretched across centuries, because what happens next will reshape the narrative. Moses will carry this ancient recognition into a destiny that will ignite nations. And to trace that path further, we must follow the trail deeper into the world of the Shassu and the inscriptions carved in stone. They appear first not in scripture, but in the archives of Egypt, a restless people of the desert recorded by scribes who feared them and yet could not ignore them. The Egyptians called them the Shassu wanderers, who moved with their flocks across Transjordan Edom and the rugged heights of Seir. To Pharaoh, they were trouble. To history, they became a clue. And then comes the inscription at Soleb from the reign of Amenhotep III, a royal monument meant to proclaim Egyptian dominance. Yet carved into its stone is a phrase that sends a tremor through biblical scholarship: Shassu of Yu. No sermon, no myth, a bureaucratic label on a list of lands and peoples. But the name is there, Yetu, astonishingly close to the sacred name. This means that long before Israel stood at Sinai, there existed a desert group associated with the name of Yahweh. This is not theology inventing history. This is history quietly preserving what theology later recognizes. The Shassu were not kings. They did not build libraries or cities. They lived between trade routes, guiding caravans, defending watering holes, negotiating survival. Yet, in the midst of their harsh world, some connection to Yahweh lingered, perhaps as a tradition of the patriarchs scattered among Semitic clans, perhaps as a revelation preserved in nomadic memory while empires forgot. The very region where the Shassu appears, Seir Edom, the Southlands, is precisely where the Bible poetically describes Yahweh coming forth. Deuteronomy speaks of him dawning from Seir. Habakkuk sings of him rising like a storm from Teman. Scripture and archaeology, often estranged, briefly shake hands here. The Shassu were not proto-Israel in a simple sense. Their religion, like the desert itself, was mixed-layered, vulnerable to pagan elements. And yet within their camps, the name survived, fragile as a desert flower, persistent as wind-carved rock. Yahweh is not born on Mount Sinai. He does not emerge from within Israel as a tribal deity. Instead, he appears as the ancient God who already walked the desert, already whispered to wanderers, already left traces on stones that Pharaoh never meant to preserve. The question grows unavoidable. If Yahweh was known among these forgotten nomads, what else has history overlooked, and what did Israel inherit that had been echoing long before Moses returned to Egypt? Hold that thought, because the next layer of the mystery forces us to step beyond archaeology and into the lives of unexpected worshipers, righteous outsiders, whose devotion confronts and enlarges our understanding of faith itself. If the Shassu and the Midianites hint at a wider memory of Yahweh, Scripture goes further. It dares to place radiant faith in people who stand completely outside the line of Jacob, as if to say, do not confine God to your family tree. First, there is Job. He does not live in Israel. He lives in the land of Uz, on the edge of the known world. No temple, no Levitical law, no Jerusalem. And yet his reverence for God is so deep that heaven itself points to him as an example of integrity. Job wrestles with suffering, cries out in anguish, but never turns his back on the one he calls his Redeemer. His story is not a side note. It is a whole book of the Bible dedicated to a man beyond Israel who knows God intimately. The Bible places a non-Israelite at the center of one of its deepest theological explorations, as if to remind us that Yahweh's search for hearts is not bounded by borders. Then we meet Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High. He appears suddenly in Genesis, stepping out of the mists of ancient Canaan, carrying bread and wine. He blesses Abraham in the name of the Most High God, and Abraham, the father of Israel, gives him a tithe. The author of Hebrews later seizes on this moment, portraying Melchizedek as a mysterious priestly pattern, a foreshadowing of a priesthood older and higher than the Levitical one. Abraham, the chosen patriarch, bows in spiritual recognition before a priest who already serves the same God. The flow of honor is not one way. It circulates. And we return again to Jethro, the Midianite priest. He rejoices when he hears what Yahweh has done in Egypt. He offers sacrifice to Yahweh. He counsels Moses with wisdom that shapes the governance of Israel. Scripture never mocks his origin. It honors his discernment. Righteous outsiders scattered across lands and languages stand like altars on the horizon, bearing witness that Yahweh has always been more than a national deity. He is the God who plants knowledge of himself in unexpected soil. If you have ever suspected that God was at work in cultures, families, or stories far from your own, let that awareness rise to the surface.
Not for outsiders.
Share it not as an argument, but as a testimony. In doing so, you join this long line of outsiders who were never truly outside his gaze. Because the question now becomes unavoidable. If Yahweh was known in fragments among the nations, what changed at Sinai? To answer that, we must watch as scattered embers of worship are drawn together into the blazing center of a covenant. There is a moment in the story of God and humanity when scattered whispers become a thunderclap. Until Sinai, the knowledge of Yahweh is like embers spread across the ancient world, glowing in Midianite tents, in the songs of Job, in the blessing of Melchizedek, in the elusive memory of the Shassu. At Sinai, those embers are drawn together into a single blazing fire. Yahweh does not change that day. What changes is the structure of the relationship. The eternal God, who was already known in fragments, now binds himself publicly to a people through covenant. He does not introduce himself as a new deity, but as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God, whose traces we have been following through deserts and inscriptions. From a historical perspective, this is the birth of a recognizable religious community. From a theological perspective, it is the moment when Yahweh turns a scattered awareness into a focused vocation. Israel is not inventing a tribal God. Israel is being summoned by the ancient God to bear his name before the nations. The covenant at Sinai is both revelation and narrowing. On one hand, it clarifies God's character, his holiness, his moral will. Laws, festivals, and rituals form a framework that shapes an entire society around the presence of Yahweh. On the other hand, this very structure can be misunderstood as ownership, as if Israel could say, "This is our God, and not yours." The covenant was never meant to shrink God down to national size. It was meant to turn Israel into a living sign, pointing back to the God who was already Lord over all. The prophets will later remind Israel of this. They speak of nations streaming to Zion, of a house of prayer for all peoples of Yahweh's fame, reaching to the ends of the earth. The covenant is not an end. It is a launch point. It takes the ancient pre-Israelite knowledge of God and centers it, sharpens it, preserves it, so that the world might finally see clearly what it had only glimpsed in shadows. In the quiet spaces between these events, we can almost imagine the Shassu by their fires Job, under his sky Melchizedek, in his city, all part of a long preparation for this concentrated moment at Sinai. The God they knew in part now engraves his words on stone. Not to erase their stories, but to bring the full story into focus. And yet this is where a new danger emerges when a clearer revelation arrives. What happens to the older memories? Do they disappear, or do they continue to echo beneath the surface of Israel's faith? To answer that, we have to confront the misunderstandings and distortions that later generations would read back into the mystery of Yahweh's wider work. Every great mystery invites not only discovery, but distortion. The story of Yahweh's worship before Israel is no exception. As soon as we glimpse desert inscriptions and righteous outsiders, two opposite misunderstandings arise, both seductive, both incomplete. On one side, some modern voices claim that Yahweh was merely a small regional deity, a desert storm god of the southern tribes, later promoted by Israel into the one true God. It sounds bold, almost revolutionary. But when you place that idea against the weight of scripture and archaeology, it begins to crack. The name appears linked to peoples and regions beyond Israel's later borders. The language of the Bible itself presents Yahweh not as a God who grows, but as a God who reveals. The question is not whether Yahweh started small and became great, but whether humanity's perception of him started dim and became clearer. On the other side, an opposite error emerges: the notion that all ancient Semitic groups who use similar language for God, Most High or YHW, were worshiping Yahweh in exactly the same way Israel later did. This too is not quite true. The Shassu, the Midianites, the early Canaanite communities, their religious worlds were mixed environments where devotion to the true God could coexist with pagan practices, local spirits, and household idols. The Bible itself testifies that even Israel struggled constantly with syncretism. The difference is not just in the syllables they pronounced, but in the covenant they entered, the revelation they received, and the purification of their worship over time. A name can be spoken with different meanings in different hearts. Some spoke the name of Yahweh as a distant power among many. Israel was called to speak that name as the sole holy center of their existence. The same God, but not the same relationship. The same Lord, but not the same level of light. Here the theology cuts deep. It is possible to have fragments of truth without fullness, a real encounter without clear understanding. That does not invalidate the fragments. It invites them into a larger story. Yahweh's work among the nations before Israel does not compete with Sinai. It prepares the ground for Sinai. And yet this subtle, beautiful balance is easy to lose. Either we shrink God down into a tribal invention, or we flatten history into a vague universalism where all worship is the same. Both paths erase the drama of Revelation. So what does this mean for us as readers of Scripture today? How should we approach the Bible? Knowing that the God of Israel was already stirring hearts beyond Israel's borders. To answer that, we must step into the final layer of this mystery, where our own faith and the ancient story quietly meet. When we turn back through the pages of this story with new eyes, something profound happens. The Bible does not shrink. It expands. Suddenly, Yahweh is not confined to the borders of Israel, nor limited to the timeline of one nation. He is already moving in deserts, in borderlands, in lives that never enter Israel's genealogy. And then he draws all those threads together through covenant prophecy and promise. This means the Bible is not primarily the story of a people discovering a God. It is the story of God revealing himself step by step to a world that only partially recognized him. When we read Genesis, Exodus, the Psalms, the prophets, we begin to see echoes. The God who comes from Seir is the same God who meets Moses. The God who blesses Abraham through Melchizedek is the same God who later speaks through the temple liturgy. The God who listens to Job's cries is the same God who will answer Israel's lament in exile. And yet, Revelation unfolds through tension. There are moments when Israel forgets that Yahweh is bigger than national identity. There are moments when the nations forget that true worship demands holiness. Both require correction. Both require grace. The covenant does not limit God. It clarifies him. The nations do not replace Israel. They are invited through Israel into clearer light. This perspective guards us from extremes. We cannot say Yahweh is merely a late invention. The inscriptions, the texts, the theological continuity contradict that. But neither can we imagine that every ancient devotion to a high God is identical to covenant faith. The Bible holds a more nuanced truth. Fragments of Revelation existed, and God patiently gathered them into a unified story. Reading Scripture with this awareness transforms our posture. We begin to notice how often God is already at work before anyone realizes it. We see his patience across centuries. We see his willingness to speak through unexpected people, cultures, and places. We see that faith at its deepest level is not possession, it is participation. Quietly, this realization becomes personal. If Yahweh was present before Israel named him, could he also be at work in ways we do not yet recognize, in conversations we overlook, in histories we never studied, in lives that seem far from our own? The mystery of Yahweh before Israel is not just an academic curiosity. It is a reminder that God's story is always larger than our categories, and that we enter it not as owners, but as guests who have been invited into Revelation. And as the final pages of this exploration close, the invitation remains open. Walk through Scripture. Slowly look for the faint traces. Listen for the distant echoes, because the God who moved before Israel formed a nation is still moving now, still revealing, still calling the world back to himself. This journey has taken us back before Israel's national story into deserts, inscriptions, and lives on the margins to discover that Yahweh was already known, already calling, already present. And far from reducing Israel's role, this truth magnifies it. The covenant becomes the moment when the God who whispered through scattered hearts spoke clearly to the world. We close the narrative, but not the reflection. Because the question remains, if God was at work long before anyone recognized his hand, where might he still be working today, unseen, unnamed, but undeniably near? If this exploration opened something in you, linger here a little longer. Like the video, share it with someone who loves Scripture and history, and leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. Your voice adds to the conversation we are building together. And if you wish to keep traveling with us, subscribe and stay close. more discoveries wait just beyond the horizon. In the next chapter, we will follow another thread why the Bible describes Yahweh as coming from Seir, and what that poetic claim reveals about faith, geography, and destiny. Until then, walk gently through the text, because sometimes the oldest secrets are the ones still speaking.